summer of 1975, congressional investigators descended upon a nondescript federal building in Washington, D.C., armed with subpoenas and decades of accumulated suspicion. What they discovered in the basement archives of the defunct Federal Children's Services would challenge everything Americans thought they knew about their government's capacity for evil. Hidden in classified files for 27 years, this is the story of 437 missing children and the former OSS operative who orchestrated their disappearance in the name of national security. The manila folders stacked floor to ceiling contained meticulous records of a psychological warfare program that targeted the most vulnerable members of American society. Children as young as 4 years old, torn from their families under the guise of federal protection, subjected to experimental procedures that would make Nazi doctors proud. Before we dive into this disturbing case, make sure you're subscribed, because here we don't chase headlines, we uncover what others buried, forgotten horrors, uncomfortable truths, and the stories most would rather forget. This channel isn't for everyone. It's for those willing to stare into the past without flinching. It's for those brave enough to learn what really happened when the Cold War came home to America's children. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Which state or country do you call home? The most chilling discovery came when investigators realized that nearly 2/3 of the documented children had no record of ever being returned to their families. At the center of this bureaucratic nightmare stood Samuel Hayes, a man whose credentials read like a Hollywood spy thriller. Former Office of Strategic Services operative, psychological warfare specialist, and the architect of interrogation techniques that had broken enemy agents across 3 continents. Hayes had convinced his superiors that America's children represented both the nation's greatest vulnerability and its most powerful weapon in the emerging Cold War. What he created in pursuit of that vision would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The scope of the program defied comprehension. Children removed from families in 43 states, transported to facilities that existed nowhere on official maps, subjected to experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Government documents reveal that Hayes personally oversaw the selection criteria, identifying families whose political affiliations, ethnic backgrounds, or economic circumstances made them suitable targets for what he euphemistically called protective intervention. Medical records recovered from the archive painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as scientific research, sleep deprivation studies that lasted for weeks, drug trials using substances that wouldn't be approved for adult testing until decades later, psychological conditioning techniques adapted from prisoner of war interrogation manuals, all conducted on children whose only crime was being born to parents the government deemed subversive. This is their story, a story of institutional evil, bureaucratic indifference, and the price paid by innocent children caught in the machinery of national security. It's a story that exposes the dangerous willingness of those in power to sacrifice the vulnerable in pursuit of abstract goals. And it's a story that reminds us why eternal vigilance against government overreach isn't just a political slogan, it's a moral imperative. The year 1948 found America in the midst of a transformation more radical than most citizens could comprehend. The Second World War had ended just 3 years earlier, but the peace that followed brought new anxieties that would reshape American society for generations. The Soviet Union, once an ally against fascism, had emerged as an existential threat to everything Americans believed about freedom, democracy, and the pursuit of happiness. The Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical reality. It was a psychological condition that infected every aspect of American life, from classroom lessons to bedroom conversations. President Harry Truman had signed the National Security Act just months earlier, creating the Central Intelligence Agency and establishing the framework for what historians would later call the security state. The legislation consolidated intelligence functions under civilian control, but it also created bureaucratic grey areas where ambitious officials could launch programs without traditional oversight. The Act's language was deliberately vague about jurisdictional boundaries, creating opportunities for expansion that would be exploited by men like Samuel Hayes. At the center of this story stands the Federal Children's Services, an agency born from the intersection of legitimate concern and unlimited authority. Official documents describe its mission as protecting vulnerable children from ideological contamination and subversive influences that threatened their development into productive American citizens. The agency's charter granted unprecedented powers to intervene in family situations deemed detrimental to national security, with minimal judicial oversight and maximum classification protections. The institutional framework that enabled such a program had been years in the making: the Office of Strategic Services, America's War-Time Intelligence Agency, had recruited some of the nation's most brilliant and ruthless minds to develop psychological warfare techniques against enemy populations. When the OSS was dissolved in 1945, many of its personnel found new homes in the emerging intelligence apparatus, bringing with them expertise in manipulation, interrogation, and psychological conditioning that would prove invaluable in domestic operations. Samuel Hayes represented the perfect synthesis of wartime experience and post-war opportunity. Born in 1912 to a middle-class family in Philadelphia, Hayes had distinguished himself as a psychology student at Harvard before the war interrupted his academic career. Military records show that he volunteered for the OSS in 1943, drawn by promises of meaningful service in the fight against fascism. His psychological training and natural aptitude for manipulation made him ideal for special operations work behind enemy lines. Hayes's wartime service had taken him across 3 continents, where he had developed innovative techniques for extracting information from captured enemy agents and breaking the morale of civilian populations. His methods combined classical psychological principles with crude behavioral conditioning, using controlled environments to reshape subjects' fundamental beliefs and loyalties. Military commendations praised his ability to achieve unprecedented results in subject compliance and information extraction. The transition from wartime service to post-war civilian roles proved challenging for many former OSS operatives. Hayes, however, found his niche in the expanding national security bureaucracy, where his specialized skills could be applied to domestic threats. Intelligence assessments from the period reveal growing concern about communist infiltration of American institutions, particularly those that shaped minds. Schools, youth organizations, and even families were viewed as potential vectors for ideological contamination that could undermine national security from within. The Federal Children's Services emerged from this paranoid atmosphere as a solution to what officials perceived as a critical vulnerability. If American children could be turned against their own country through exposure to subversive ideas, then protecting them from such influences became a matter of national survival. The agency's founding documents articulated a mission that combined child welfare rhetoric with national security imperatives, creating a bureaucratic hybrid that could justify almost any intervention in the name of protecting both individual children and American society. Hayes's appointment as the agency's deputy director for special programs reflected his reputation within intelligence circles as someone who could achieve results regardless of conventional limitations. His superiors understood that protecting children from ideological contamination might require methods that wouldn't survive public scrutiny. The classification system that surrounded the agency's operations ensured that such methods could be implemented without interference from oversight bodies or media attention. The technological capabilities available to the Federal Children's Services in 1948 were primitive by modern standards but sophisticated enough to support extensive surveillance and control operations. Electronic eavesdropping equipment could monitor private conversations in homes and schools, while psychiatric evaluation techniques could identify children deemed susceptible to subversive influences. Transportation networks could move selected children quickly and quietly to facilities located far from their home communities, making resistance or rescue attempts extremely difficult. The legal framework supporting these operations relied heavily on existing child welfare statutes that gave government officials broad authority to intervene in family situations deemed harmful to children's well-being. By expanding the definition of harm to include exposure to subversive political ideas, the agency could justify removing children from families whose only offense was holding unpopular political opinions or maintaining ethnic traditions that officials viewed as un-American. The medical establishment's cooperation with these programs reflected the era's faith in scientific solutions to social problems. Psychiatrists and psychologists who had served in military roles during the war brought their expertise to civilian applications, viewing government service as an opportunity to advance both their careers and the national interest. Professional journals from the period reveal enthusiasm for applying military-developed psychological techniques to domestic challenges, including what researchers euphemistically termed preventive mental health interventions. The selection criteria for these interventions reflected the political anxieties of the era with chilling specificity. Families identified as targets included union organizers, ethnic minorities with suspected foreign loyalties, intellectuals with documented left-wing sympathies, and immigrants from countries that had fallen under Soviet influence. The agency's files reveal a systematic approach to identifying and cataloging potential threats, using neighborhood informants, school personnel, and medical professionals to gather intelligence on families whose children might benefit from protective intervention. The bureaucratic machinery that supported these operations functioned with the efficiency of a military organization and the secrecy of an intelligence agency. Regional offices coordinated with local authorities to identify suitable targets, while specialized transportation units moved selected children to facilities that existed nowhere on public maps. The scope of the program reflected the unlimited resources available to agencies operating under national security classifications. Budget documents recovered decades later reveal expenditures that dwarfed most domestic programs, with funding streams that bypassed normal congressional oversight through creative accounting mechanisms. The money funded everything from facility construction to experimental equipment, creating an infrastructure that could process hundreds of children simultaneously while maintaining complete operational security. This was the institutional context that made possible one of the most extensive violations of civil liberties in American history. A perfect storm of post-war anxiety, bureaucratic ambition, and unlimited authority had created conditions where government officials could target the most vulnerable members of society with impunity. The children who disappeared into this system were selected not for any crimes they had committed, but for the political opinions of their parents and the ethnic backgrounds that made them suspect in the eyes of national security officials. The tragedy that unfolded over the next 3 years would demonstrate the dangers inherent in any system that prioritizes security over liberty, efficiency over accountability, and institutional loyalty over individual rights. It would show how quickly well-intentioned programs can evolve into instruments of oppression when operated in secrecy and shielded from public scrutiny. Most importantly, it would reveal the price paid by innocent children when adults in positions of authority lose sight of the moral principles that should guide their actions. On the morning of September 14, 1948, 8-year-old Maria Santos experienced something that would haunt her for the rest of her life and expose the first cracks in what appeared to be a routine child welfare intervention. Maria lived with her parents and 3 siblings in a cramped apartment above her father's small grocery store in the Little Italy section of Boston, where the narrow streets echoed with the sounds of multiple languages, and the federal government had begun to take an uncomfortable interest in the political loyalties of recent immigrants. Maria's father, Giuseppe Santos, had arrived from Italy in 1936, bringing with him not only dreams of American prosperity, but also membership in labor organizations that federal investigators had classified as potentially subversive. His grocery store served as an informal community center, where Italian immigrants gathered to discuss news from their homeland, often in heated conversations that neighborhood informants dutifully reported to federal authorities. Giuseppe's name had appeared on federal children's services watch lists for 6 months before anyone in his family realized they were being observed. The morning began like any other for the Santos family. Giuseppe had opened the store before dawn, arranging produce displays while his wife Rosa prepared breakfast for their children. Maria helped with, her younger siblings, a responsibility that had made her mature beyond her years and, particularly, protective of her family's stability. None of them noticed the unmarked sedan that had been parked across the street for 3 consecutive days, or recognized the significance of the official-looking visitors who had been asking questions about the family in neighboring shops. At precisely 8:30 a.m., as Maria walked to Sacred Heart Elementary School 6 blocks away, 2 well-dressed strangers approached, her with smiles that didn't reach their eyes and identification badges that bore the seal of the Federal Children's Services. According to witness statements collected years later, the men introduced themselves as government social workers conducting routine evaluations of children whose families had been identified as requiring federal assistance. They explained that Maria needed to come with them for medical examinations and educational assessments that would help ensure she received all the services available to American children. The 8-year-old's initial resistance was overcome through a combination of authoritative reassurance and subtle intimidation that reflected training in psychological manipulation techniques. The agents explained that her parents had already been informed of the evaluation process and were expecting her to cooperate fully with federal officials. They suggested that failure to comply might result in difficulties for her father's business license and her family's immigration status, implications that a child could sense even without fully understanding their meaning. Maria's abduction, though it would never be officially characterized as such, occurred in broad daylight on a busy street where dozens of potential witnesses observed what appeared to be a routine interaction between government officials and a school-aged child. The professionalism of the agents' presentation and the official nature of their credentials discouraged intervention from passers-by who might otherwise have questioned the appropriateness of removing a child from her normal routine without obvious parental supervision. The sedan that carried Maria away from her neighborhood contained equipment that revealed the true purpose of her removal: restraint devices disguised as safety equipment, medical monitoring instruments, and recording devices capable of capturing conversations and physiological responses indicated that this was not a routine social services intervention. The facility where Maria was taken existed nowhere on public maps and bore no external markings that would identify its purpose or governmental affiliation. Located in a converted mansion 40 miles outside Boston, the building had been purchased through a network of shell corporations and modified to serve as a residential research facility capable of housing up to 50 children simultaneously. The architectural modifications included soundproofing, observation rooms, and medical facilities that would have been sophisticated even by military standards. Maria's first hours in custody followed protocols that had been developed through extensive experimentation on adult subjects during wartime intelligence operations. She was separated from her personal belongings, subjected to medical examinations that included blood draws and neurological assessments, and interviewed by personnel who used psychological profiling techniques to establish baseline measurements of her emotional stability and resistance to authority. The process was designed to create disorientation and dependency that would make subsequent conditioning more effective. The living conditions at the facility combined elements of institutional care with subtle psychological pressure designed to break down subjects' existing loyalties and beliefs. Children were housed in dormitory-style rooms that prevented privacy and encouraged mutual surveillance, while daily routines were structured to maximize institutional control over every aspect of their lives. Meals, sleep schedules, recreational activities, and even bathroom breaks were regulated according to protocols that treated the children as experimental subjects rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity. Maria's experience during her first week of captivity revealed the systematic nature of the psychological conditioning program. Her daily educational sessions exposed her to propaganda materials designed to undermine her loyalty to her family and ethnic community, while promoting absolute obedience to government authority. These sessions were combined with medical treatments that included experimental drugs intended to increase suggestibility and reduce resistance to ideological manipulation. The experimental protocols applied to Maria and other children at the facility pushed the boundaries of medical ethics in ways that would have shocked the American public if they had been conducted openly. Sleep deprivation experiments tested the subject's ability to maintain cognitive function under extreme stress, while sensory isolation procedures explored the psychological effects of prolonged separation from normal human contact. Drug trials using substances that hadn't been approved for human testing evaluated the effectiveness of chemical agents in modifying behavior and personality. Maria's psychological profile, compiled through extensive observation and testing, identified her as particularly resistant to the conditioning techniques being employed at the facility. Her strong family bonds and well-developed sense of personal identity made her less susceptible to the manipulation strategies that had proven effective with other subjects. This resistance made her valuable as a test case for more aggressive intervention techniques, subjecting her to procedures that would have permanent psychological consequences. The medical records from Maria's captivity document a progression of increasingly invasive procedures, justified by her failure to respond appropriately to standard conditioning protocols. Electroshock treatments were administered to induce temporary memory loss and personality changes, while surgical procedures explored the possibility of achieving behavioral modification there. Rough, direct brain intervention. These procedures were conducted without anesthesia in many cases, both to observe subjects' pain responses and to increase the traumatic impact. Maria's case became significant not just for the suffering it caused, but for the insight it provided into the institutional mindset that made such atrocities possible. Staff members at the facility viewed their work as serving a higher purpose that justified any level of individual suffering, believing that protecting American children from ideological contamination required the sacrifice of those children who had already been exposed to subversive influences. This rationalization allowed medical professionals and government officials to participate in systematic child abuse while maintaining their self-image as patriotic servants of the national interest. The documentation of Maria's ordeal, preserved in classified files that wouldn't be discovered for decades, reveals the methodical approach that characterized the Federal Children's Services Program. Every procedure was carefully recorded, every response meticulously analyzed, and every failure to achieve desired results met with escalated intervention techniques. The children weren't just victims of government overreach, they were experimental subjects in a research program designed to perfect techniques for controlling human behavior on a mass scale. The psychological impact of Maria's experience extended far beyond the immediate trauma of her captivity. The conditioning techniques employed at the facility were designed to create permanent changes in personality and behavior that would make subjects more compliant with government authority throughout their lives. Even children who eventually returned to their families carried with them psychological scars that affected their ability to form normal relationships and maintain emotional stability. Maria's resistance to the program's objectives ultimately saved her life, but couldn't spare her from the lasting damage caused by months of systematic abuse. Her case file documents the frustration of facility personnel who couldn't break her psychological defenses despite employing increasingly extreme measures. This frustration would eventually lead to a decision that revealed the true nature of the program and exposed its operators to the possibility of discovery by outside authorities. The first incident represented more than just the beginning of Maria Santos's nightmare. It was the opening chapter in one of the most extensive violations of human rights ever perpetrated by the American government against its own citizens. The systematic nature of her abduction, the sophisticated facilities used for her detention, and the experimental procedures applied during her captivity all demonstrated that this was not an isolated case of government overreach, but rather the implementation of a carefully planned program designed to process hundreds of children through a system that treated them as laboratory animals rather than human beings. As congressional investigators delved deeper into the recovered Federal Children's Services archives, a disturbing pattern emerged that revealed the true scope of Samuel Hayes's psychological warfare program. What appeared to be isolated incidents of overzealous child protection were actually systematic, targeting operations that had removed children from families across 43 states with the precision of a military campaign and the secrecy of a covert intelligence operation. The selection criteria discovered in classified documents exposed a chilling logic that prioritized political considerations over any legitimate concern for child welfare. Families were identified as targets based on detailed profiles that included their political affiliations, ethnic backgrounds, religious practices, and economic circumstances. Union organizers found their children disappearing during crucial labor negotiations. Immigrant families with suspected ties to communist countries watched their sons and daughters vanish into a bureaucratic maze that offered no recourse and no explanations. The case of the Kowalski family in Detroit illustrated the systematic nature of these targeting operations. Stanley Kowalski worked as a foreman at a Ford Motor Company plant where he had been instrumental in organizing workers' rights protests that federal officials viewed as potentially subversive. His involvement in legitimate labor activities had earned him a place on Federal Children's Services watch lists that tracked the political activities of industrial workers across the Midwest. When the agency decided to intervene, they took both of his children within a single week, using different pretexts to avoid attracting attention to the coordinated nature of their operation. 10-year-old Thomas Kowalski was removed from his elementary school during a routine health inspection that federal agents had arranged with cooperative school administrators. The boy was told that his parents had requested his participation in a special educational program designed to help children from immigrant families adapt to American values and opportunities. 6-year-old Anna Kowalski was taken from a neighborhood playground by agents who claimed her parents had been hospitalized and she needed immediate placement in federal protective custody until their recovery. The transportation network that moved these children revealed sophisticated logistical planning that could only have been achieved with substantial resources and institutional cooperation. Unmarked vehicles carried children to railway stations where special trains transported them to facilities located in remote areas far from their home communities. The trains were equipped with medical personnel and restraint equipment, indicating that the operators expected resistance from their young passengers and were prepared to use force to maintain control. The facilities that received these children represented a substantial infrastructure investment that demonstrated the program's intended permanence and scale. Converted military bases, abandoned mental hospitals, and specially constructed compounds provided housing for hundreds of children simultaneously while maintaining complete isolation from outside observation. Each facility was staffed with medical personnel, psychological specialists, and security guards who had been recruited from military and intelligence backgrounds specifically for this program. The experimental protocols implemented at these facilities varied according to the specific research objectives being pursued at each location. Some facilities focused on psychological conditioning, techniques designed to create loyalty to government authority, while others explored medical interventions that could permanently alter subjects' behavior and personality. The case of 12-year-old David Chen revealed the international dimensions of the targeting criteria. David's parents had immigrated from China in 1946, fleeing the civil war that would eventually bring communist forces to power. Despite their demonstrated opposition to communism, the family's ethnic background and cultural practices had identified them as potential security risks in the paranoid atmosphere of early Cold War America. David's removal was justified by federal agents who claimed his parents' traditional Chinese medicine practices constituted child endangerment that required immediate government intervention. David's experience at a facility in rural Montana demonstrated the cultural dimension of the psychological conditioning program. Children from ethnic minority backgrounds were subjected to Americanization procedures that went far beyond language instruction or civics education. Their traditional names were replaced with Anglo-Saxon alternatives, their cultural practices were forbidden and punished, and they were indoctrinated with messages that portrayed their ethnic heritage as inherently un-American and potentially treasonous. The medical experiments conducted on ethnic minority children reflected the era's pseudo-scientific beliefs about racial differences and cultural loyalties. Researchers tested theories about genetic predispositions to political disloyalty, conducting procedures that combined legitimate medical research with racist assumptions about the inherent characteristics of different ethnic groups. These experiments included blood analyses seeking to identify biological markers of subversive tendencies, brain surgery intended to eliminate cultural memory, and drug trials designed to suppress ethnic identity formation. The religious dimension of the targeting criteria became apparent through cases like that of the Goldstein family in New York City. Rabbi Abraham Goldstein had been identified as a person of interest due to his synagogue's connections with international Jewish organizations that federal officials suspected of harboring communist sympathizers. When agents decided to intervene, they took all three of his children, using different justifications that obscured the coordinated nature of their operation while maximizing the psychological impact on the family. The Goldstein children's experiences revealed the anti-Semitic undertones that influenced federal children's services operations, despite official rhetoric about protecting all American children equally. Jewish children were subjected to forced conversion procedures that combined religious indoctrination with psychological conditioning designed to eliminate their ethnic and religious identity. These procedures included exposure to Christian religious instruction, participation in Christian religious services, and punishment for any expression of Jewish cultural practices or beliefs. The coordination between federal agencies and local authorities exposed the extent of institutional cooperation that made these operations possible. School administrators provided student records and facilitated removals during school hours, while medical professionals conducted evaluations that justified federal intervention. Police departments provided transportation and security support, while judicial officials signed custody orders based on evidence that was often fabricated or grossly distorted to support predetermined conclusions. The case of the Murphy family in Boston revealed how the program targeted American citizens whose only offense was their political beliefs. Patrick Murphy had been a vocal critic of American foreign policy, particularly the emerging Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union. His participation in peace organizations and anti-war demonstrations had earned him a place on federal watch lists that tracked domestic dissent. When federal agents decided to target the Murphy family, they used child welfare laws to justify removing both children based on alleged evidence of political indoctrination that constituted child abuse. The agents claimed that exposing children to anti-government political ideas created psychological harm that warranted immediate federal intervention to protect their emotional and intellectual development. This interpretation of child welfare law created a precedent that could be used to justify government intervention in any family whose political beliefs differed from official orthodoxy. The Murphy children's experience at a facility in Vermont demonstrated the political dimension of the psychological conditioning program. Children whose parents held dissenting political views were subjected to intensive re-education procedures designed to create loyalty to government policy, regardless of its moral or practical merits. These procedures included exposure to propaganda materials that portrayed government critics as traitors, participation in patriotic ceremonies that required public denunciation of their parents' political beliefs, and punishment for any expression of independent political thought. The documentation of these cases revealed the systematic nature of the psychological conditioning techniques being employed across multiple facilities. Children were subjected to controlled environments that eliminated all sources of emotional support and independent information, creating conditions of total dependency on their captors for basic needs and human contact. This dependency was then exploited to reshape their fundamental beliefs and loyalties through a combination of reward and punishment that operated according to behaviorist principles adapted from animal psychology research. The geographical distribution of facilities revealed strategic planning that prioritized operational security over cost efficiency or humanitarian concerns. Children were deliberately transported far from their home communities to prevent rescue attempts and minimize the possibility of discovery by local authorities who might be sympathetic to the families involved. This transportation often separated siblings and eliminated any familiar reference points that might help children maintain their psychological resistance to conditioning procedures. The financial resources devoted to these operations reflected the program's priority within the national security establishment. Budget documents revealed expenditures that exceeded the annual budgets of most federal agencies, with funding sources that included direct appropriations, intelligence community transfers, and military research contracts. The money funded everything from facility construction to medical equipment, creating an infrastructure capable of processing hundreds of children while maintaining complete operational security. The pattern that emerged from this analysis revealed a systematic program of government-sponsored child abuse that operated with impunity for 3 years while claiming to serve the national interest. The targeting of vulnerable families, the sophisticated infrastructure for processing victims, and the experimental procedures that treated children as laboratory animals all demonstrated that this was not an aberration of government policy, but rather its logical extension in an era when national security concerns were used to justify any level of individual suffering. The recognition of this pattern marked a turning point in the congressional investigation that would eventually expose the full scope of the Federal Children's Services Program. What had initially appeared to be isolated cases of government overreach was revealed to be a coordinated campaign of state terrorism directed against American families whose only crime was their failure to conform to official standards of political loyalty and cultural assimilation. The breakthrough that exposed the full, horrifying scope of the Federal Children's Services Program came through an unlikely source, a maintenance worker's discovery of a hidden archive in the basement of a facility that had been abandoned for 24 years. In the spring of 1975, renovations at a former military installation in upstate New York uncovered a sealed storage room containing medical equipment, experimental apparatus, and thousands of pages of documentation that revealed the true nature of Samuel Hayes's psychological warfare program. The hidden archive contained materials that Hayes and his associates had been unable to destroy during the program's hasty termination in 1951. Complete experimental protocols, detailed medical records, photographic documentation of procedures, and correspondence between facility directors provided congressional investigators with evidence that exceeded their worst fears about government abuse of power. The documents revealed not just systematic child abuse, but a coordinated research program designed to perfect techniques for controlling human behavior on a mass scale. The most damning evidence came from Hayes's personal correspondence with military and intelligence officials who had provided funding and oversight for the experimental program. Letters discovered in the archive revealed that Hayes viewed the children not as victims requiring protection, but as research subjects whose suffering was justified by the potential military applications of the psychological conditioning techniques being developed through their abuse. His correspondence described the children as expendable assets in a research program that would provide American intelligence agencies with unprecedented capabilities for psychological manipulation. The experimental protocols documented in the archive revealed procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Children were subjected to surgical procedures designed to test the effects of brain damage on personality and behavior, with subjects selected based on their resistance to standard conditioning techniques rather than any medical necessity. Drug trials exposed children to experimental substances that caused permanent neurological damage, while psychological conditioning procedures combined sensory deprivation, physical torture, and sexual abuse to break down subjects' psychological defenses. The medical records contained in the archive provided detailed documentation of the suffering endured by individual children throughout their captivity. Case files tracked subjects' responses to various experimental procedures, recording everything from physiological changes to psychological breakdown, with clinical detachment that revealed the dehumanization that had enabled such systematic abuse. The records showed that facility personnel viewed the children's pain and terror as data points in research projects rather than evidence of human suffering that should have prompted immediate intervention. The photographic documentation discovered in the archive provided visual evidence of atrocities that shocked even experienced congressional investigators who had seen extensive evidence of government misconduct during previous inquiries. Images showed children restrained in experimental apparatus, subjected to medical procedures without anesthesia, and confined in isolation chambers designed to produce psychological breakdown. The photographs had been taken not for documentation purposes, but as evidence of experimental results that could be analyzed and replicated in future research projects. The correspondence between facility directors revealed the systematic nature of the abuse and the institutional culture that had made it possible. Letters discussed experimental procedures as routine, administrative matters, reporting on subjects' responses to various interventions with the same bureaucratic tone used for equipment maintenance or budget planning. The correspondence showed that personnel at every level of the program had been aware of the systematic abuse being inflicted on children while viewing it as necessary work in service of national security objectives. The scope of the experimental program exceeded anything that congressional investigators had imagined possible within the American government. Documents revealed that facilities had been established in 12 states, each specializing in different aspects of psychological conditioning research. Some facilities focused on breaking down existing loyalties and beliefs, while others concentrated on implanting new loyalties and behaviors that would make subjects permanently compliant with government authority. Still others served as testing grounds for interrogation techniques intended for use against enemy agents in future intelligence operations. The research methodologies employed at these facilities combined legitimate psychological research with torture techniques that had been developed during wartime intelligence operations. Children were subjected to controlled environments that eliminated all sources of emotional support and independent information, creating conditions of total dependency that could be exploited to reshape their fundamental beliefs and behaviors. The techniques included prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, sensory overload and deprivation, physical torture, sexual abuse, and administration of experimental drugs that altered brain function. The Selection C criteria for experimental subjects revealed the program's integration with broader intelligence and surveillance operations that monitored American families for signs of political disloyalty or cultural nonconformity. Children were chosen not based on any evidence of abuse or neglect in their families, but according to profiles that identified them as suitable test subjects for specific experimental procedures. The criteria prioritized children whose disappearance would be unlikely to generate public attention while providing subjects who represented the demographic groups that intelligence agencies hoped to control through psychological manipulation. The administrative structure that coordinated these experiments demonstrated the program's high-level support within the intelligence community and military establishment. Personnel files revealed that facility directors had been recruited from military and intelligence backgrounds, while medical staff included psychiatrists and psychologists who had developed expertise in psychological warfare during military service. The program's integration with broader intelligence operations ensured access to resources and protection from oversight that enabled systematic abuse to continue for 3 years without detection. The international connections revealed in the correspondence exposed the program's relationship with similar experiments being conducted by allied intelligence agencies. Letters documented cooperation with British, Canadian, and West German researchers who were exploring related psychological conditioning techniques, sharing experimental results, and coordinating research projects that used children from multiple countries as test subjects. This cooperation demonstrated that the abuse of American children was part of a broader international research program designed to develop techniques for psychological control that could be used against enemy populations during future conflicts. The termination of the program in 1951 had been triggered not by moral concerns or oversight failures, but by security concerns that the experiments might be discovered by hostile intelligence agencies who could exploit evidence of systematic child abuse for propaganda purposes. Documents revealed that Hayes and his superiors had been primarily concerned with protecting the program's classification rather than addressing the ethical violations that had characterized its operations. The hasty destruction of most records and relocation of surviving subjects had been motivated by operational security rather than any recognition of moral responsibility to the children who had been victimized. The fate of the children who had been processed through the program revealed the lasting impact of the experimental procedures that had been conducted without their consent or their families' knowledge. Medical records showed that many subjects had suffered permanent psychological and neurological damage that would affect them for the rest of their lives, while others had been so thoroughly conditioned that they were unable to form normal emotional attachments or maintain independent thoughts and beliefs. The most severely damaged subjects had been institutionalized in mental hospitals, where they received minimal care and no acknowledgement of the government's role in their condition. The cover-up operations that had concealed the program's existence for 24 years demonstrated the intelligence community's commitment to protecting institutional interests over individual rights or public accountability. Surviving subjects had been given new identities and relocated to communities where their histories could be concealed, while their families had been paid settlements that included non-disclosure agreements prohibiting them from discussing their children's disappearance. The elaborate deception had been maintained through ongoing surveillance and intimidation that ensured silence from potential witnesses who might threaten the program's secrecy. The psychological conditioning techniques that had been perfected through experimentation on American children were subsequently used in intelligence operations around the world, demonstrating that the suffering inflicted on innocent victims had indeed served the military purposes that Hayes had promised his superiors. Documents revealed that the techniques had been employed against enemy prisoners during the Korean War, used to break down captured intelligence agents during Cold War operations, and applied to civilian populations in countries where American intelligence agencies sought to influence political outcomes. The revelation of these connections exposed the true cost of the Federal Children's Services Program, which extended far beyond the immediate suffering of the children who had been victimized. The techniques developed through their abuse had enabled subsequent atrocities that might not have been possible without the expertise gained through systematic experimentation on American children. The program had not just violated the rights of individual families, it had contributed to a broader pattern of government-sponsored violence that would continue for decades. The full scope of the revelation overwhelmed even experienced congressional investigators who had previously exposed significant government misconduct. The systematic nature of the abuse, the sophisticated infrastructure that had supported it, and the high-level protection that had enabled its continuation for 3 years without detection, all demonstrated a level of institutional evil that challenged fundamental assumptions about American democracy and the rule of law. The discovery forced a confrontation with the reality that democratic institutions could be used to perpetrate atrocities that rivaled those committed by totalitarian regimes. When congressional investigators finally confronted the full scope of the Federal Children's Services atrocities, they faced an impossible choice that would define American intelligence oversight for generations. The evidence they had uncovered revealed systematic child abuse that demanded justice and accountability, but it also exposed operational capabilities that intelligence officials claimed were essential for national security. The resolution of this conflict would demonstrate the government's continued willingness to prioritize institutional protection over individual rights, even when confronted with evidence of the most heinous violations of human dignity. The immediate response to the congressional discovery involved the largest classification review in American intelligence history, as officials scrambled to contain evidence that could expose not just the Federal Children's Services Program, but related operations that remained active in 1975. Within hours of the investigators' arrival at the abandoned facility, military personnel had cordoned off the site and begun the process of reclassifying documents that had been scheduled for routine destruction. The speed and scale of this response demonstrated pre-existing contingency plans for containing potential exposure of sensitive programs. The classification process that followed revealed the extent of institutional cooperation required to maintain such extensive secrecy for over 2 decades. Documents were reclassified at the highest levels of national security classification, making them inaccessible even to congressional oversight committees with appropriate clearances. The classification review extended beyond the Federal Children's Services Program to include related research that had been conducted by military and intelligence agencies, creating a comprehensive barrier to further investigation or public disclosure. The legal framework that governed the congressional investigation limited the extent to which evidence could be made public or used to pursue criminal prosecutions against responsible officials. National security exemptions that had been built into oversight legislation provided intelligence agencies with broad authority to withhold information that might compromise ongoing operations or reveal sensitive capabilities. These exemptions were interpreted so broadly that virtually all evidence of the child abuse program was deemed too sensitive for public disclosure or judicial review. The fate of surviving participants in the program revealed the government's continued commitment to concealing evidence of systematic abuse even when confronted with irrefutable documentation of institutional misconduct. Children who had survived the experimental procedures were relocated to new communities where their identities could be concealed and their histories erased from public records. The relocation process included medical treatment designed to address the lasting effects of their abuse, but it also involved continued psychological conditioning intended to ensure their silence about their experiences. The financial settlements offered to affected families represented both an acknowledgement of government responsibility and an extension of the cover-up that had concealed the program's existence for decades. The settlements included substantial monetary compensation that reflected the severity of the abuse that had been inflicted on the children, but they also required comprehensive non-disclosure, agreements that prohibited recipients from discussing their experiences with media, researchers, or other government officials. The agreements effectively purchased continued silence while providing legal protection against future lawsuits that might expose additional evidence of government misconduct. The medical treatment provided to surviving victims demonstrated the government's recognition of the lasting damage caused by the experimental procedures while continuing to conceal the true nature of their injuries. Survivors were provided with psychiatric care and medical support through Veterans Administration facilities that had experience treating combat-related psychological trauma, but their medical records were classified at levels that prevented independent medical research or public health analysis of their conditions. The treatment was designed to address symptoms rather than underlying causes, ensuring that evidence of systematic abuse remained concealed even within medical documentation. The personnel accountability process revealed the institutional protection that had enabled the program to operate with impunity and continued to shield responsible officials from meaningful consequences. Samuel Hayes and other senior officials were quietly transferred to other positions within the intelligence community rather than facing criminal prosecution or public accountability for their role in systematic child abuse. The transfers were justified as necessary to protect operational security and maintain institutional continuity, prioritizing government efficiency over justice for the victims of government-sponsored violence. The congressional response to the investigation findings demonstrated the limits of legislative oversight in confronting systematic abuse by intelligence agencies. Committee members who had access to classified evidence were prohibited from discussing their findings in public forums or using the information to pursue legislative reforms that might prevent similar atrocities in the future. The oversight process became a mechanism for containing political damage rather than ensuring accountability or preventing future abuse. The media coverage of the investigation reflected the successful government effort to limit public disclosure while managing political consequences of the discovery. News reports acknowledged that congressional investigators had uncovered evidence of government misconduct involving children, but they were unable to provide specific details about the nature or scope of the abuse due to classification restrictions. The limited reporting created public awareness of government wrongdoing without generating the level of outrage that might have forced more comprehensive accountability measures. The academic and research community's response to the limited information that became available revealed the lasting impact of the program on American understanding of government capacity for abuse. Researchers who attempted to study the psychological conditioning techniques that had been developed through experimentation on children found their access to relevant documentation blocked by classification restrictions that prevented independent analysis of government research methods. The restrictions ensured that the knowledge gained through systematic child abuse remained under government control rather than contributing to legitimate medical or psychological research. The international implications of the program's exposure created diplomatic challenges that further complicated efforts to achieve accountability or prevent similar abuses in the future. Allied intelligence agencies that had cooperated with the Federal Children's Services Program faced their own potential exposure if American investigations proceeded too aggressively, creating pressure for continued secrecy that transcended national boundaries. The international cooperation that had enabled the program also created ongoing obligations that prevented complete disclosure or accountability. The psychological impact on congressional investigators who had been exposed to evidence of systematic child abuse revealed the personal cost of confronting institutional evil within democratic systems. Several investigators required psychiatric treatment after reviewing documentary evidence and photographic materials that provided graphic documentation of government-sponsored torture of children. The psychological trauma experienced by investigators demonstrated the emotional toll of maintaining democratic oversight while being prohibited from achieving meaningful accountability or justice. The institutional memory of the program within intelligence agencies ensured that the techniques developed through systematic child abuse would continue to influence government operations even as specific evidence of their development remained classified. Training materials, operational procedures, and research methodologies that had been perfected through experimentation on American children became part of standard intelligence community capabilities that could be applied to future operations without acknowledgement of their origins in systematic abuse. The Federal Children's Services Program represented more than just a historical atrocity. It demonstrated the capacity of democratic institutions to perpetrate systematic evil while maintaining public legitimacy and political support. The program's concealment for over 2 decades, the limited accountability that followed its discovery, and the continued classification of evidence all revealed structural features of American democracy that enabled rather than prevented government abuse of power. The survivors of the program, now elderly if still alive, carry with them memories of government-sponsored abuse that they are legally prohibited from sharing while continuing to receive government benefits contingent on and their continued silence. Their silence ensures that the techniques developed through their childhood suffering remain available for future use by intelligence agencies that view individual rights as obstacles to operational effectiveness rather than fundamental principles that should guide government action. What do you think really happened to the children whose files were never found? The congressional investigation identified evidence for over 400 victims, but only located records for fewer than half of that number. The missing files represent children whose fates remain unknown, families whose questions were never answered, and evidence that may have been destroyed to conceal atrocities that exceeded even the documented horrors of the Federal Children's Services Program. The story of the 1948 federal program that removed children from families for secret psychological experiments serves as a reminder that democratic institutions are only as moral as the people who operate them, and only as accountable as the citizens who demand transparency and justice. The techniques developed through the systematic abuse of American children continue to influence intelligence operations around the world, ensuring that the suffering of innocent victims contributes to ongoing patterns of government-sponsored violence that might otherwise be prevented through meaningful accountability and democratic oversight. Leave your theories in the comments below about what really happened to the missing children and whether similar programs might be operating today under different names and classifications. If this story gave you chills, you need to see what we uncovered about the military's involvement in these psychological experiments, a connection that reaches into the highest levels of government and continues to influence national security policy today. The Federal Children's Services Program officially ended in 1951, but its influence on American intelligence operations and government secrecy continues to this day. The psychological conditioning techniques that were perfected through systematic experimentation on children became standard tools in the intelligence community's arsenal, applied to everything from prisoner interrogation to population control operations in foreign countries. The institutional frameworks developed to conceal the program's existence became templates for maintaining operational security around controversial government programs that might not survive public scrutiny. The legal precedents established during the 1975 congressional investigation created long-lasting barriers to democratic oversight that continue to protect intelligence operations from meaningful accountability. The broad interpretation of national security exemptions that prevented disclosure of the program's details established legal frameworks that have been used to conceal subsequent government misconduct, ensuring that the sacrifice of the program's victims continues to serve institutional interests decades after their abuse ended. Modern declassification processes reveal tantalizing fragments of evidence that suggest the Federal Children's Services Program was not unique, but rather part of a broader pattern of government experimentation on vulnerable populations that continued well beyond the program's official termination. References in recently released documents hint at related programs that targeted elderly, patients in mental hospitals, prisoners in federal facilities, and military personnel who were exposed to experimental procedures without their knowledge or consent. The survivors of the program who are still alive today continue to live under the constraints of non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from contributing to public understanding of government, capacity for abuse, or participating in research that might help prevent similar atrocities in the future. Their enforced silence represents not just a personal tragedy, but a continuing obstacle to the democratic accountability that might prevent future victims from enduring similar abuse at the hands of their own government. The techniques developed through the Federal Children's Services Program influenced not just American intelligence operations, but international approaches to psychological warfare and population control that continue to affect civilian populations around the world. The research conducted through systematic child abuse contributed to capabilities that have been used in conflicts from Vietnam to Iraq, ensuring that the suffering of American children in the 1940s and 1950s continues to generate new victims in contemporary conflicts. The institutional culture that enabled the Federal Children's Services Program persists within intelligence agencies that continue to prioritize operational effectiveness over individual rights and institutional loyalty over democratic accountability. The same mindset that justified systematic child abuse in the name of national security continues to influence decision-making processes that affect millions of people who never consented to bear the costs of government policies implemented in secret and shielded from public oversight. The story of the missing children of 1948 serves as more than just historical documentation. It represents a warning about the dangers inherent in any system that operates without meaningful accountability or transparent oversight. The techniques that were used to conceal systematic child abuse for over 2 decades remain available to conceal contemporary government misconduct, ensuring that similar atrocity could be perpetrated today with the same impunity that characterized the Federal Children's Services Program. The families who lost children to this program never received the justice they deserved, and the children who survived carry psychological scars that will never fully heal. Their suffering represents not just a historical tragedy, but an ongoing moral debt that American democracy has never acknowledged or attempted to repay. The continued classification of evidence ensures that this debt will never be fully calculated or properly addressed. As we consider the implications of this historical atrocity, we must ask ourselves what safeguards exist today to prevent similar abuses and whether those safeguards are adequate to protect vulnerable populations from government officials who might view individual suffering as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of abstract policy objectives. The answer to that question will determine whether the sacrifice of the Federal Children's Services victims serves as a warning that prevents future atrocities or simply as precedent that enables them. The legacy of Samuel Hayes and the Federal Children's Services Program lives on not just in classified archives, but in the institutional structures and legal frameworks that continue to shield government operations from democratic oversight. Until those structures are dismantled and those frameworks are reformed, the potential for similar atrocities remains embedded in the very foundations of American democracy. The missing children of 1948 deserve more than our sympathy. They deserve a commitment to the kind of democratic accountability that might prevent future children from experiencing similar fates. That commitment requires not just historical awareness, but active engagement with the ongoing struggle to maintain meaningful oversight of government power and ensure that individual rights are never again sacrificed on the altar of national security. Their story reminds us that the price of freedom is not just eternal vigilance against foreign enemies, but constant attention to the potential for abuse by domestic institutions that operate in secret and claim to serve our interests while potentially serving only their own. The children who disappeared into the Federal Children's Services Program paid that price with their lives and their suffering. The question that remains is whether we will honor their sacrifice by ensuring that it never happens again. What happened to the children whose files were never found remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in American history. Congressional investigators identified evidence for over 400 victims but located records for fewer than half that number. The missing files represent not just bureaucratic inefficiency but potentially deliberate destruction of evidence that might have revealed atrocities that exceeded even the documented horrors of the program. Those children and their families deserve acknowledgement even if justice remains impossible after so many decades of enforced silence. Until the complete truth about this program is declassified and made available for public scrutiny, until meaningful accountability is achieved for the officials who perpetrated and concealed systematic child abuse, and until institutional reforms are implemented to prevent similar atrocities, the missing children of 1948 will continue to haunt American democracy as symbols of its capacity for evil and reminders of the eternal vigilance required to preserve freedom and human dignity. Their silence has been purchased with government settlements and enforced through legal restrictions, but their story continues to demand our attention and our commitment to the kind of democratic accountability that might prevent future children from experiencing similar fates. The price they paid for, our understanding of government capacity for abuse, must not be wasted through indifference or complacency. The techniques developed through their suffering continue to influence intelligence operations around the world, ensuring that the legacy of their abuse extends far beyond American borders and affects populations who have no knowledge of the childhood suffering that contributed to their contemporary victimization. The international implications of the program remind us that injustice anywhere contributes to injustice everywhere, and that the failure to achieve accountability for historical atrocities enables contemporary ones. As we conclude this investigation into one of the darkest chapters in American history, we must remember that the story of the Federal Children's Services Program is not just about the past, but about the present and future of democratic accountability. The institutional structures that enabled systematic child abuse in the 1940s and 1950s continue to exist today, waiting for officials who might view individual suffering as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of policy objectives that serve institutional rather than public interests. The missing children of 1948 paid the ultimate price for our education about government capacity for evil. The question that remains is whether we will honor their sacrifice by ensuring that such atrocities never happen again, or whether we will allow their suffering to be forgotten as we pursue other priorities and assume that democratic institutions will automatically prevent similar abuses. Their story demands not just our attention, but our action. Action to maintain meaningful oversight of government power, to demand transparency in intelligence operations, and to ensure that individual rights are never again sacrificed in the name of national security. The children who disappeared into the Federal Children's Services Program cannot speak for themselves, but their silence continues to cry out for the kind of justice and accountability that might prevent future victims from experiencing similar fates. The legacy of the Federal Children's Services Program serves as a permanent warning about the dangers of unchecked government power and the importance of maintaining eternal vigilance against institutional abuse. The missing children of 1948 remind us that the price of freedom is not just constant attention to foreign threats, but constant scrutiny of domestic institutions that claim to serve our interests while potentially serving only their own. Their story will continue to haunt American democracy until meaningful accountability is achieved and institutional reforms are implemented to prevent similar atrocities. The techniques that were used to conceal their abuse for over 2 decades remain available to conceal contemporary government misconduct, ensuring that the potential for similar violations continues to exist within the very institutions that claim to protect us.